got so much appreciation for you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay, well, I have about 7:05 and the little bells have stopped. So what I would, as soon as we get the live stream going, there it is. Hold on a second. I got to get rid of the echo. Okay. We have the live stream running. So what I would like to do is introduce Florence. Well, first, I introduce me. I'm Harvey Ferdman. I'm president of the Maryland Heights Township Democratic Club. And we also have the president of the Creve Coeur Township Club, Florence Pullen. And Florence, I believe you're going to introduce someone who's going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yes, I am, Harvey. And good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have these meetings together. And we continue to hope to have wonderful meetings in the future. I am the president, as Harvey said, of the Creve Coeur Democratic Club. And the Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the Honorable Sue Meredith. She's the committee woman for the Creve Coeur Township Democratic Club. Sue, are you on? She was for a while.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, then, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
Okay. You gonna stand up for this one and look at Harvey's flag?
Yeah, we can look at Harvey's flag or whatever.
I have a flag, but it doesn't show up as well as his does. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
Which is
one nation,
one nation, under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
and just
liberty and justice for all.
justice for all.
Thank you. And I noticed that we have a number of elected officials joining us this evening. And it's a little hard for me to see everyone on my mosaic Zoom screen here. So if you guys would just introduce yourselves. If two people talk at once, I'm sure you'll figure out whose turn it is. So elected officials, including committee people, if you would just introduce yourselves. All right, everyone's shy. Tracy McCreary, you're unmuted. Why don't you go first?
I'm Diane Caston, and I'm the committee woman from Lee.
Hi, I'm Representative Tracy McCreary, State Rep in District 88 in Olivet Creve Coeur area.
Good evening.
We're David and Dale Steimer, committee people from Maryland Heights Township.
Good evening. I'm Jill Shoup. I'm not on the screen for reasons that you don't want to see, but I'm the state senator from Missouri's 24th district and delighted to be here with you tonight, Brittany. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Councilwoman Nicole Greer from the city of Creve Coeur representing Ward 2, and I'm also not on the screen for the same reasons that Senator Shoup stated.
Hi there, I'm Marco McNeil. I'm committee woman for Northwest Township and also on the Hazelwood School Board.
Any others?
Hi, I'm Kathy Paulsmeyer and I'm committee woman from Chesterfield.
Sue Meredith?
Florence already introduced me. I'm committee woman for Creve Coeur and a former state rep.
Again, it's hard for me to see everyone on the screen. There's so many. Anyone else, elected officials? And I would like to give a shout out and ask her to introduce herself if she's okay with that. I saw you on here a moment ago. Karen, did you disappear? Karen Nickel, who's very involved with the citizens group, who's keeping us all safe from the burning landfill with the illegally dumped nuclear waste. If you want to just introduce yourself, Karen.
Hi, Karen Nickel. I am co-founder of Just Moms STL, and I think Harvey kind of summed it up. Thanks, Harvey.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, with that, I would like to turn the program over to Florence, who will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Good evening again, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Brittany's mother, Dr. Gwendolyn Packnett, who put me in touch with Brittany. And so we're going to go with that and also talk about her extensive work that she's been doing around the country. Brittany Packnett Cunningham is a social justice activist, educator, and writer, leading at the intersection of culture and justice. She has and continues to build platforms to amplify, educate, and activate everyday people to take transformative action against every form of injustice. She is an NBC News and MSNBC contributor, Harvard Institute of Politics 2020 Fellow, and host of Undistracted, and she can tell you more about that too, a news and social justice podcast with an intersectional lens. She's the former co-host of iHeartRadio's Best Political Podcast of 2019, Pod Save the People, and is the founder and principal of Love and Power Works, a full-service social impact and equity agency. Brittany's forthcoming book, We Are Like Those Who Dream, is due to hit the shelves in 2021. Her TED Talk on confidence has garnered over 5 million views worldwide, making it one of the top 10 most popular TED Talks of 2019. Brittany is a former elementary teacher and educator executive. In the past, Brittany held top roles at Teach for America, was a congressional policy advisor, and co-founded Campaign Zero, leveraging her management, communication, policy, and equity skill set on broad justice issues, from public education to criminal justice. Brittany was a member of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force and the Ferguson Commission, helping lead the country and her community through change during times of tumult. Brittany has graced the September 2020 cover of British Vogue and a previous cover of Essence magazine. Been listed as one of Time's 12 new faces of Black leadership, and has been honored by BET, Political Magazine, Madame Claire, the Trayvon Martin Foundation, Higher Heights, and more. She serves on the Gucci Changemakers Council and the Sephora Equity Advisors Board. She and her husband lives in Washington, D.C. Brittany, welcome back to St. Louis. We're happy to have you.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be with you. I'm grateful for the work that you all are doing on this call in my hometown, in your hometown, to make sure that we are pushing not just for political outcomes, but that we are also pushing, most importantly, for more just outcomes. So I'm excited to be in conversation and to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, are there any questions? Harvey is running the question and answer over there. Harvey?
Yeah, I think we can do this as an open forum. I think everyone's pretty familiar with Zoom, and not to talk over to each other too much. I'll kick off the first question. Brittany, you were involved with President Obama's the policing reform. Can you speak about that? And now that President Biden-elect is coming in, what that means for that program?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is it still remains to be seen a bit. So as their transition teams are being put together, especially the transition team around the Department of Justice and the Attorney General's office, we'll look to see what they indicate because our task force was run out of there. So just for kind of historical context, December 1st, 2014, a number of us activists were asked to the White House to speak directly with President Obama. We sat in the Oval Office for about an hour and a half during what was supposed to be a half-hour meeting. There were about 4 of us from Ferguson who were active Ferguson protesters. 2 of us, myself and Rasheen Aldridge, who is some of you all's colleague in the State House, were the youngest members of the Ferguson Commission, and we were also asked to go to that meeting. Now, that meeting happened to coincide with the very first meeting of the Ferguson Commission, but Rich and Starsky said, go to DC, we'll see you when you get back, represent us well. So we went to that meeting. After the conclusion of that meeting, we went to another, what the White House calls big table meeting. So in that meeting is President Obama, Vice President, now President-elect Biden, folks from the cabinet, folks like Arnie Duncan, police chiefs and activists from all over the country, people like Al Sharpton, Ben Crump, et cetera. And so we sit in that big table meeting to have a broader conversation about policing in America. At that meeting, at the end of 2014, of course, this is a couple of months after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, President Obama announced the creation of his 21st Century Policing Task Force. When he announced the creation of it, then began the vet. So we didn't know who from that meeting was going to be asked to be on the task force. From St. Louis, it ended up being me. So I went through that whole vetting process, which many people are going through right now in the course of this transition. As long as the outgoing president actually moves out of the way, we can get on about that business. Ended up on that task force with, I think it was 12 other folks who I believe were committed to trying to figure out real solutions here. Because this was put together by the White House, as you can imagine, they needed to have a diversity of voices. So there were a long time, but I would say progressive police chiefs. There were people like Brian Stevenson, who many of you probably know from his work at the Equal Justice Initiative or his book or the film by the same name, Just Mercy. People like Connie Rice, who was former head of the Advancement Project and had been a long-time activist in the Los Angeles community. So if you look back on issues of police violence like Rodney King, LaTanya Harlan, and others, we see Connie's work at work in the community and across the entire country, really shaping what activism on this issue would look like for decades to come. So we filled that task force. We traveled the entire country, went to half a dozen cities to listen to everyday folks, to listen to activists, to listen to citizens, to listen to police officers, to listen to researchers and academics about what the solution should be moving forward, and then divvied up the work. We built a report from that task force. The task force was officially brought together in late January. We were told that we were the members. We finished the vet. We came together to meet for the first time in January. President Obama wanted an initial report in March. So it was a very, very quick turnaround. And it was a lot of time on the road and a lot of time in conversation and community with people who were really trying to get this right. So in March, we presented our preliminary report to him, which had a number of sections, including police legitimacy, understanding that no institution of government, as you all know so well, can do their work without being seen as legitimate by the people. That's what our founding documents say, and that is most certainly, I believe, what American citizens feel. To issues of technology, right? Talking through body cameras and how we should be thinking very critically about privacy issues there, because there are lots of communities who don't feel safer with the existence of body cameras, to things like training and the diversity of departments, et cetera. So this was 2015. We gave him the initial report in March. We went back when, let me be very clear. When we gave him the initial report in March, we literally went in to have a meeting with him. The task force and President Obama in the Roosevelt Room, and he comes in with a copy of the task force with tabs and notes inside. So he's read the entire thing, taken it in, and has real opinions on this. That is the kind of leadership I believe we deserve in America, irrespective of your political ideology. And so we sat down and we walked him through what our plans were. He gave us feedback. We took that feedback and the feedback of other folks in the field, and we continue to hear from people and refine that report. We ended up releasing the final report in May. I was not at the event with President Obama when we released that final report because it was my brother Barrington's graduation day from Yale Divinity School. So we had to choose the right priority there. And I was very, very glad to be in New Haven, Connecticut with my mom and our family on that day. But when we released the final report, the idea was that everyone from activist groups to community organizations to city councils to, yes, any of the 18,000 local police departments around the country could take that report and begin to actualize the things in it. That these were a set of recommendations for everyone from the federal government to local police departments, and that people could take action on those things right away. We did see certain actions from certain folks. We saw a number of more progressive police chiefs, including the ones who were on the task force, ask for members of the task force to come to their department and talk through some of these things. People like Chuck Ramsey, who's the former police chief in Philadelphia, who was the co-chair of the committee. He was one of the people who was often traveling to police departments to actually walk them through that work. The idea also was that we had recommendations for the Department of Justice about how to restrict funding for police departments that continue to show themselves undeserving. So police departments that continue to be murderous, that continue to harm communities, that continue to wreak havoc and cause violence were the ones that shouldn't be getting that extra grant money from the federal government. There were also things in the report about ensuring that there was a national database of police violence, because at this time in 2015, that didn't exist. The FBI was not tracking that data. It was up to activists like us who co-founded Mapping Police Violence and media companies like the Washington Post and the Guardian, who started to track some of those things. One of the things that I was really focused on getting into the report, and it took a lot of maneuvering, and I had to get my allies together to actually get this in the final version, but it was ensuring that we had external and independent investigations when the police killed someone. This is actually not law across the country. It takes a lot of doing to actually get external and independent investigations done when the police harm someone. And that was actually, believe it or not, in 2015, a pretty hard sell. The idea that the police shouldn't investigate themselves seemed pretty clear to us on the ground in Ferguson and Baltimore and other cities. It certainly seemed clear to folks like myself and Rasheen and Starsky Wilson and Tracy Blackman and others who were doing work on the Ferguson Commission. But that was a bit of a hard sell. So we really had to push that through, ended up getting it in the final report. Certainly saw some movement. One of the things that the grassroots organizers really pushed for, that I was a part of, was demilitarizing police. So we got the Obama administration to roll back rules that allowed decommissioned military equipment to go to local police departments. If you remember, if you were on the streets of Ferguson with us, or you remember the images, you remember the MRAPs, you remember the armored vehicles, you remember the mounted rifles, you remember the riot gear and the tear gas and the pepper spray. These are weapons of war, but we were citizens, we were neighbors, we were standing in our own neighborhoods, being treated like enemy combatants. And so we thought it was incredibly important to decouple this militarism from community policing. So this was 2015, and we got the Obama administration to move on a number of things, including that. Fast forward to 2016, Donald Trump wins, and I say that with an asterisk still, the election, and pretty summarily pulls that report from the Department of Justice website, indicating very clearly that he's got no intentions of supporting these efforts, of moving these reforms forward. And and this is the last thing I'll say on this question, I use the word reforms very intentionally, because in 2015, we were looking at those really, I won't say incremental, but certainly very specific changes, right? Regulatory changes, legislative changes, statutory changes that could move this piece and move that piece. And we're hoping that together it would start to make a dent in the problem, knowing full well that none of these things by themselves or even altogether would stop the police from killing people, period. Now we're at a place in 2020 where I really believe movements around the country are saying, we've asked for reform, we've pushed for reform. There needs to be full-scale transformation because no fewer people are dying at the hands of police in America than were in 2015. The police are still killing upwards of 1,000 people in this country every year. And we know that it doesn't have to be that way. If you look at Japan, if you look at Australia, if you look at the UK, the police there kill very few people, if any, every single year. It is possible to live in an economically developed country and not be in a place where the police are trigger happy. And so at the very least, making sure that police are held accountable for their actions, but truly at the very most, investing in the institutions that actually keep us well and transforming or shifting out of the way the institutions that continue to harm us, I think is the much broader conversation now. So we will see if the Biden-Harris administration wants to pick up that particular work or wants to advance it. And frankly, I think the latter needs to happen. So if they call on the 12 of us who were on that task force before, great. But even better, I think that there are some additional voices that really need to be at the table to make sure that from the top down, this is an issue that's taken seriously. Thanks for that question.
Okay, Brittany, thank you very much. I have a question. This is Florence.
Yes, ma'am.
I've been here. Well, our topic tonight was after the election moving forward. But I saw an article you wrote on voter fraud, I believe.
Yes.
With MSNBC.
Yes, ma'am.
Why do you think there's so much talk about voter fraud with this election?
The only reason why we have
so much talk about it?
Oh, certainly. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's okay. I said, why do you think there's so much talk about voter fraud in this election, with this election?
Truly the only reason why folks like myself who get on television and talk about the news have to talk about voter fraud is because Donald Trump wants us to talk about voter fraud. The real conversation is voter suppression, which is very different than voter fraud. Voter fraud is supposedly voters who are trying to defraud a perfect system. Voter suppression is a system that is actually locking people out from participating in it. The latter is happening frequently. The former, research, data set after data set after data set shows us barely ever happens, if at all. And it certainly was not a factor in this election. So unfortunately, we have watched over, I would really say 5 years, right? Not just the 4 that he's been in office, but since his campaign, we have watched Donald Trump undermine our traditions and institutions that allow people to access truth and information. So what have we seen? We've seen him talk about fake news. We've seen him go after particular anchors. We've seen him stand up and deny facts. We've seen him stand up and completely make up stories. We've seen him stand up and lie and insist that the lie is truth and tell anyone who would dare call him out on the lie, he would say that they're fraudulent or that they're fake or whatever, right? The effect of that, unfortunately, and people who have studied disinformation tactics in other countries will tell you this. Sarah Kensendor, who is a journalist from St. Louis, will tell you this. Her podcast, Gaslit Nation, is incredible, and she's been talking about this the entire administration. Folks who study that will tell you this is a tactic. It is not just Donald Trump being Donald Trump. It is not just him kind of being this fantastical, strange figure that he would like for us to believe he is. This is a tactic because 4 years later, you have a media calling the election based on data and facts, and now any proportion of 70 million people calling all of those folks liars and saying that the election isn't over because people were fraudulent and stole it. So that is the effect of 4 years of what President Obama called the other day truth decay, right? As the truth has been allowed to decay, people have been able to insert their own narratives. And one of those narratives is the Democrats defrauded the American public and Donald Trump really won the election. So what I said in that op-ed that you just talked about, because I wrote 2 op-eds last week, it was a busy week. I wrote one in Time Magazine about the necessity of disciplined hope in this moment, which I hope we'll talk about in a little bit, because I do think that it is a necessary piece of how we move forward after this election. But the other piece that I wrote is the one you referred to, Ms. Florence, about the fact that I believe that voter fraud actually has deeply racist tendencies, because Republicans historically have always cried voter fraud when they have lost, and when it has been Black voters and traditionally disenfranchised voters who have caused their loss. I say that because we have watched over in 2016 and once again in 2020 and in between in the midterms in 2018, intentional direct targeting of Black communities, Indigenous communities, Latinx communities, and poor communities in order to try to promote Republican candidates and disenfranchise and suppress typically Democratic voters. And so these are the kinds of activities that we saw in 2018 when Stacey Abrams was running for governor in Georgia, and Brian Kemp was the referee in his own game because he was the Secretary of State and the candidate, the Republican candidate for the governor of Georgia. When he is closing polling locations and purging 200,000 when he's purging 200,000 names from the rolls, most of which we now have come to find out 2 years later were erroneously or wrongly purged, and that most of those names that were purged were coming from predominantly Black communities. That's intentional voter suppression. That is intentional voter disenfranchisement. In Florida, we watched in 2018 Floridians rally together and say that they believed that people who had paid their debt to society, who had been formerly incarcerated, should have their voting rights restored. 1.4 million Floridians were supposed to have their voting rights restored on that day. And instead, Governor Ron DeSantis came in and instituted a poll tax and said that you had to pay your fines and fees in order to receive that right back. What that did was two things. One, it kept people locked out, but two, it also sent the message that you can never come back into this system. So even as organizers and famous people like LeBron James and others flooded Florida with money to pay off those fines and fees, and were actually getting people back to the place where they could pay that restitution and reclaim their vote, what happened was not enough people got the message because they had heard the governor was going to make them pay their fines and fees. So even if they could have accessed their ballot, they didn't, because the prevailing ideology and the messaging was so pervasive that they couldn't actually get there. So that's how we see voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement working right now. I mean, a young woman in Arizona, a young Indigenous woman named Allie, had to literally create a program called Ride to the Polls, where she got folks on horseback and rode the 10 miles between some reservations and polling places. There's no reason why a polling place should be 10 miles from your home. Your polling place should be walkable, just like your elementary school should be. So we're in a situation where the GOP has gotten scientifically good at suppressing and disenfranchising votes all around this country, to the point where I believe they are completely flabbergasted when marginalized people overcome that mountain of barriers, not only to show up and vote, but to vote in such large numbers that it overtakes the oppression that they face and actually can produce results that no one expected. No one expected Georgia to go blue. No one expected Wisconsin to be a state that could turn this election around. No one expected Arizona to have the kind of results that it did. No one expected Philadelphia to show up and bring all of Pennsylvania with it. And so we're in a place right now where we have to name things what they are, because otherwise we allow somebody else to run away with their own version of the story. And that is Donald Trump's only tactic to win, is the lie, because he's lost so clearly. So we're talking about voter fraud because he wants that to be the conversation. So we have to clarify this and silence this part of the conversation once and for all. Voter fraud is not a thing. It has never been a thing. It is only the cry of Republicans when they can't understand how marginalized people beat them. And what we have to be fighting tooth and nail until we eradicate it fully is voter suppression. I believe that has to start with the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act. That will be much easier to do if we win these 2 Senate seats in Georgia. And I know that you all are probably talking to your colleagues down there trying to make sure that John Ossoff and Ralph Warnock get those seats.
Thank
Good,
you.
Brittany. This is Charlie Dooley.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. Listen, I agree with you on your subject matter about the police. But one of the things I do want to bring up is a couple of things you mentioned about internal affairs. It should not be left in the hand of the police department. They cannot police their own selves. That makes no sense. But also, the retribution ought to be tied to police pensions. That wakes them up real quickly. But what I really want to speak to is, what you didn't speak to is the responsibility of prosecutors with police brutality. Could you expand on that, please?
Absolutely, and I appreciate that question. And before I get to prosecutors, you are absolutely right. A conversation about police pensions, a conversation about police unions, these are necessary conversations for this work. And I say this as a former teacher. I say this as somebody who deeply believes in labor and labor organizing, who has family, who is, our union members. Like that is deeply important to me. But police unions are a situation unto themselves. They're not like the AFT or the NEA. They are much more actually like the NRA. And unfortunately, we've seen so many police unions actually subvert community justice. So they are, some police unions are actually working in the background to create the kind of police contracts that make it incredibly easy for police officers to skip out of being held accountable. There are police union contracts that allow for police officers to not be questioned for up to 30 days after they have killed someone. There are police union contracts that allow police officers to see the evidence that's going to be used against them in misconduct cases. There are police union contracts that allow police misconduct reports to be expunged after a certain amount of time, never to be recovered again. There are police union contracts that make it difficult for police departments to talk to each other. So when we see so many of these instances, like in George Floyd's case, for example, where the officer that killed someone had a bad rap at their last police department and was able to easily move between police departments, it is sometimes police unions that allow that to happen because they put a firewall up between police departments and they can't talk to each other, or they allow police officers who have been suspended to be rehired with private arbitration, being led by arbitrators that nobody elected and that the public did not hire. So I'm glad, Mr. Dooley, that you brought that up because it is an important part of the conversation, both the pensions and the police unions. To the question of prosecutors, and this is, I think, incredibly relevant for St. Louis. Prosecutors are a piece of the equation that we cannot leave out. And I want to be very clear. The work ultimately is for the police to stop causing violence, for the police to stop killing people, for the police to stop harming people. In the event that it happens, though, the only way that we deal with this ultimately is if the police are accountable, just like you or I would be if we took someone's life. Unfortunately, that is not happening because of things like qualified immunity, which should be expunged at the federal level. But it's also part of what's happening when prosecutors refuse to act in the interest of the people. We all know the saying, a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich if they want to. Getting an indictment is not actually a terribly difficult thing, except in the case of a police officer, or at least so we are told. So having prosecutors who have the gumption to actually indict police officers, to hold them to account when misconduct occurs, and the range of misconduct, not just killing people, but all manners of violence, to hold them to account, to make sure that they are not able to access their pensions or their jobs after that, is critically important. Why? Because I think everyone here would agree, public servants should be held to a higher standard. All of you have entered some form of public service ready and prepared to be held to that higher standard because you answer to the people, that you understand that you derive your power from the people and you have to respect the source of that power. If police officers who have even more power than elected officials do over the everyday lives of human beings cannot operate that way, then they shouldn't be on the force. And I firmly believe that the entire institution should be transformed, but at the very least, people who have not proven themselves to be responsible enough, level-headed enough, well-trained enough, unbiased enough to hold a badge and a gun in our communities, which is a license to kill if used incorrectly, then those people should be held to account and should be sending a message to anyone else who is prepared to behave that way. I also think that we need progressive prosecutors who are actually ready to stop criminalizing things that shouldn't be criminalized. Homelessness, poverty, marijuana use, these are things that are decimating our communities when they are criminalized, instead of us actually finding solutions for people, the kind of jobs, shelter, and strong economy that people need not to be in those situations. So the conversation about prosecutors absolutely has to be on the table. There is a question as to whether or not we should throw away the entire criminal legal system. And I think, frankly, as hard as a conversation that is, we should be having it, because as Americans, we're supposed to be able to face the hard things. But at the very least, having someone in seat like a Rachel Rollins in Boston, or a Kim Foxx in Chicago, or a Kim Gardner in St. Louis City, those are the kinds of steps that we should be taking in the right direction. Thanks for that question.
My name's Joan, and I have a question if no one else does. Hi. First of all, thank you. This is great. And this is the first meeting I've attended. This may be a very novice question, and if so, I apologize for that. But it's been one that that's been on my mind for a bit. You mentioned holding the narrative, like people who are in control of the messaging. That is so much power. And I think that's been demonstrated for, I don't know how many years now in our nation. One thing that confuses me is it seems like they're on a different playing field as Fox News and those type folks. My question is, for example, are they not like so like if CBS or another news network, if they make an error, they have to come out with a correction. Mm-hmm. And we don't see that from Fox News. So is Fox News not and I don't know the proper terminology, licensed or accredited to the same journalistic credentials, or held to the same journalistic quality or standards? How can they get by with these, they're not very good tellers of the truth or keepers of the truth? How do they get by with that?
It's not a novice question at all. It's a real question, because they shouldn't, but the question is, who are the standard bearers, right? The FCC has jurisdiction over a number of things. So the FCC will fine you if you say anything on the forbidden list of curse words, right? Your station will get a fine if you do that. But it's not the same for things that are not factual. And I actually think that this is a real question for this moment, because not only have we seen Fox News play it fast and loose with the truth, shall we say, we've also seen the emergence of these other sources that are, some of which are, shall we say, infotainment, right? That have no desire to actually inform people in any serious way. And then we have ones that are just clearly white nationalist newsletters. Like Breitbart is a white nationalist pamphlet that's online. It is not a news source. Same with the Daily Caller, right? There are places that are conservative leaning, like the National Review, and then there are places that are basically cleaned up KKK pamphlets, like Breitbart. And I say this as somebody who Breitbart likes to target. So I may take it a little personally, but that's okay. There is, I think, to your question though, a responsibility of the American people. We are the ones who have to call it out. And it can feel like that's not enough. And so I certainly understand the feeling of saying, who is reffing the game here? Who is actually watching for the truth and making sure that folks don't just get away with this? And I frankly think that this is not, I know this is a conversation that folks are having inside of newsrooms, that people are having at social media companies, because the way in which this party and this administration in particular have, what's the word I'm looking for? The way that they have exploited channels like Fox News, places like Twitter, places like Reddit. It's incredibly dangerous. I mean, you can read all the background on Roger Ailes and what he intended to do in building Fox News. It was never actually a place that was about the truth. That's why he had to say it was fair and balanced, to try to convince himself and us that that's what it was. But that was never actually his intent, right? His intent was to be a kingmaker. His intent was to create an addiction, which unfortunately he successfully has. What we know about most Fox News viewers is that most of them only get their news from Fox News. So whereas folks who watch other stations may seek a number of news sources, they may read the New York Times and the Washington Post or watch NBC or listen to NPR, they are getting all of their news from Fox. And as a media mogul, that is precisely what Roger Ailes wanted to build. He wanted to build a channel that his viewers would not turn off. And so there are certain things that he did to create that kind of atmosphere. There are people with certain aesthetics that he promoted. There are ways that he leveraged female anchors in order to, and their physicality in order to do that, unfortunately. And there are stories that he has continued to tell that have stoked fear, particularly in white communities, that have been successful at helping him create that addiction for the viewer that he was seeking. So it's not a novice question at all. You are observing exactly what Roger Ailes wanted to create, and you are calling it out exactly as it is. It is up to us to make sure that the people in our lives who may be subject to that addiction are actually getting the facts. And the hard part is that unfortunately research shows us that the typical ways we might try to debunk myths actually are more harmful than they are helpful. So there are studies that show, you've seen probably those memes that say myth, fact, right? Or false, true, right? Whenever you repeat the falsehood, it actually acts in a way that it helps embed the falsehood more, because you're just repeating it and people are hearing it more and more. And so it's harder to distinguish between what's false and what's true. So what we actually have to be doing is fundamentally and unequivocally just saying what's true. We don't say Donald Trump said this, but this is what's true. We just say this is what's true. So we don't say Donald Trump says that he won the election, but actually here's a spreadsheet of facts and figures that nobody's ever going to remember about why Joe Biden won the election. That's not an effective messaging tactic. What you say is President-elect Joe Biden, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. You just lead with the truth in a way that continues to reinforce that all-powerful narrative as you led with. But it is a really tricky situation, and companies are going to have to figure out, news companies in particular, how they do that better. Twitter has started to flag the president's tweets. I'm one of those people who believes that if you violate the terms and services agreement, even if you're the president, you shouldn't be on the platform, because I'd get kicked off the platform, you would get kicked off the platform. But I know that they're having those conversations internally, and that's because the people keep pushing, because we keep raising the flag and saying you cannot allow disinformation like this to persist on your platform. You cannot allow somebody with this much power to lie on your platform. Especially when we look at the disinformation around COVID-19, it has been deadly. There is no way around that. So I wish I had a more perfect answer for you. I wish I could tell you, oh, call this 1-800 number and they'll get the lie off the air. Maybe we'll get to that point one day. I don't know. But right now, it's about us waving the flag, telling the truth, and holding these companies to account to make sure that they do it.
So who does the FCC, I mean, I guess ultimately the people, but so is there a legislative body, or who can intervene and tighten up the criteria, if you will, of the FCC?
Yeah, so the members of the FCC are appointed, and they tend to be, I think I can't remember if there are 3. I don't want to get it wrong. But they're appointed, and they're bipartisan. So part of that is party selection. A part of what has happened under this administration, though, is that the FCC hasn't actually always been fully staffed. So there hasn't always actually been a fully situated decision-making body there. So one of the things we've seen happen is the continued consolidation of media companies. So right now, if you look at some news broadcasters, they own part of your cable, they own 17 stations nationally. They'll own, 40 stations locally. So they actually end up being these behemoth monopolies. And that's one of the things that activists have been really worried about, because it's hard to make sure that truth gets through when there are only a couple of arms that are controlling everything that comes through. Somebody put in that the FCC does not regulate cable news. That is true. So that is a really important point. But the FCC on Twitter and the internet and those kind of things, they have jurisdiction there, but they've not always been fully staffed. And the FCC is not something that most people actually pay attention to. So it's for all of us to become much more literate in that. And then there are legislative actions that can be taken as well. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Thanks for the question.
Anyone else?
I have a question.
Okay.
I am very pleased about what has happened with the national election. I'm so glad that we are going to have a President Biden. However, I am very disheartened about what is happening in Missouri. We are going in the exact opposite direction. And what can we do? I mean, this also goes with what Joan said. The ads that the GOP put on television were nothing but lies. They instituted an investigation against Nicole Galloway just in order that they could say she's being investigated. And then the election is over and they say, oh, well, let's end the investigation.
Yeah.
They got away with a crime. And what they said about Jill, what they said about Deb Lavender makes me furious. And I don't know what I can do about it. What can we do about Missouri and the supermajority?
Oh, a fantastic question. It is hard to be a speck of blue in a sea of red. No doubt about it. And when we're not in a pandemic, I still live part of the year in Missouri, so I still vote in Missouri. So I masked up, put on a shield and a whole beekeeper suit, got on a plane to go home to vote, to make sure, because I was not going to trust the mail under this president. So I got home, I voted early absentee, and I was excited to check the box for Nicole Galloway, not only knowing the history that she could make, but given the conversations I had had with her personally, feeling like she could help really move things forward, especially after the catastrophic years in the governor's mansion, right? Because when you have not just bad policy, but really bad scandal, it is very difficult to actually rally people to move forward. I really think that the answer comes down to political education. The warfare being waged on voters is a war of disinformation. It is a war that some countries have learned how to play for a long time, but that I think for a lot of American voters is very new. So getting on Facebook and not knowing what's real and what's fake, seeing something that looks like a totally legitimate news story and not understanding that you're being lied to, seeing a television commercial and not actually knowing either that you are being lied to or where to go to find out if this is true. That is all part of the tactic. The part of the tactic is that we are overwhelmed with so much information that we do not have the time, energy, or resources to actually go and decipher between what is real and what is not and make a decision for ourselves. So it really does come down to political education. That is our armor as voters. That is our armor as the people. I think that there are organizations to invest in and learn from and partner with that are doing that work really well locally. Action St. Louis is one of my favorite organizations back home. It is co-led by two very good friends of mine, Kayla Reed and Michelle Higgins, who is the pastor at St. John's UCC. And so much of what they do is actually educate the public on what the policy is. So this 2.5-year Close the Workhouse campaign to close the workhouse, the medium security jail in downtown St. Louis, was taken on by Action and by Metropolitan Congregations United and by OBS and by so many others. And the Close the Workhouse campaign did the hard, arduous work of educating people such that when the misinformation started to come, this idea that, well, if you close the jail, the streets will be flooded with criminals and all of that stuff, that people were armed against it, right? Because they had facts about what was happening inside the workhouse. They understood how the nature of the workhouse was dehumanizing. They understood how the actual facilities were deeply damaging to people physically, mentally, and emotionally. They understood how that money could be redirected in ways that would benefit all citizens instead of incarcerate people when often their only crime was being homeless or being poor. And so the political education that went into the front end of that campaign is what made it ultimately successful in the back end, right? And then you're also organizing to create political pressure to move older people to vote in the way that you want, et cetera. But they had the people behind them because they did the education first. And I think so often in the interest of quick wins, we forget the political education piece. As a former teacher, I can tell you, there are very few standards about civic education that are on our list. Teachers are already working very, very hard and doing one of the hardest jobs there is. And have very, very few resources to actually teach young people what it means to be a good and informed citizen, not to teach a political ideology, but to teach what it means to research candidates, to understand what different branches of governments do, to understand how to decipher proper political information and figure things out for yourself. These are things that are not being taught in schools adequately. So we have to teach them ourselves and make up for what's not being done there. We are in the middle of a 60-year GOP strategy, right? They did not go for a quick win here. Amy Coney Barrett is the flag on a long play. When you look at segregationists who ultimately lost that battle, who then chose Roe versus Wade and choice as a wedge issue, who then created a supermajority in the religious right, who then said, we are not only going to run candidates, we're going to create super PACs and we're going to create think tanks and we're going to create heritage foundations, and they're going to have lists of judges that we should be putting in at the local, state, and federal level. And we're going to be putting in our own sheriffs and our own police chiefs and our own mayors and our own governors. They played the long game. And they educated their people well enough on their talking points to get all of those people in line ready to play the long game with them. Frankly, and you'll never hear me saying this again about the GOP, but frankly, we need to learn from that and actually understand how important it is to get our people educated and in line with the things that we care about. We know our values are right, but people have to understand the narrative. They have to have the political skill to decipher correct information. They have to be politically educated, and they have to be motivated and ready to move. And those are things you can't do in piecemeal. You have to do them over a long period of time. So we really need to be engaged in some long-term planning. I think Miss Murdoch had a question.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, how are you? It's lovely to see
you. You are a speaker. We're so proud of you at the NAACP Youth Council. So we're so proud of you. Oh, how are the young people around your age or college age getting into politics now? Do you see that as our future? Because that's what we need.
Absolutely. And thank you for calling me young. I turned 36 last Thursday, so thank you so much. It is. I do believe that they are really getting engaged. You know, when you look at the numbers of brand new voters in 2020, they smashed expectations. So this narrative that young people are apathetic or they don't care about politics, I truly believe is false. As was stated earlier, I've been this is my third time being a fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics. So I've been spending a lot of time with college students, and they are incredibly invested because they understand that the decisions being made now will affect them over the long term. Their climate change will affect them over the long term. Gun violence will affect them over the long term. Even COVID, right? I mean, I think that there's some misinformation spreading around who suffers from COVID because it unfortunately is affecting still so many people as we see these increased surges. But they're even recognizing that if our health systems do not have the resources to service at this point what happens when the next pandemic is stronger, what happens when fewer people are insured, what happens when the Supreme Court changes Obamacare and suddenly they have different worries than their older siblings did when that was instituted, right? So I really think that they're playing the long game and they're not sitting idly by. I talked to a young woman named Gabrielle. We did an Instagram live. She was one of the youth ambassadors for Michelle Obama's When We All Vote. And they asked me to get on Instagram live with her. And she said, well, can I talk to you afterwards? Because she wanted mentorship. So we got on FaceTime and she had a lot of questions and was telling me about the organizing she was doing in her community. And she's not even old enough to vote. But she estimates that she registered probably 50 different people because she was communicating with people in her peer group about how important it was and making sure that they had a plan to vote. So I say that I bring Gabrielle up because I think that she's a clear example of the future and really the present and how seriously young people are taking this. I think they understand the power of media and technology and they're using it in ways that even I don't think of. Political education is happening on TikTok. I know you think your young people might just be scrolling all day and you're like, please get off of that phone. Political education is happening on TikTok. There are things that people do not bother to teach in school that they are learning on TikTok. Folks are getting registered on TikTok. They're making their voting plans on TikTok. They're getting informed about issues on TikTok and Twitter and Instagram stories and reels and all the other things we have now. So they understand how to use those tools. I think what really is most powerful, though, is intergenerational partnership. And Ms. Murdoch, I know this is what you do. This is what you were invested in. You were invested in making sure that young people have the information and feel empowered to be able to do their work. And there is an opportunity for folks of all generations to be sharing these lessons with one another. And like I said, Gabrielle didn't just call to talk. Like, she wanted mentors. She said, this is what I want to do. And I want to talk to somebody who knows a little bit of something about it. So young people are hungry for the wisdom of their elders. They are hungry for the wisdom of people who've walked some of these steps before. And I think figuring out how to do some of that outreach in both directions would be a really positive thing moving forward. Not only to make sure the young people are engaged, but to the last question, that they are educated on how to move through this work.
Thank you so much. That's so good to hear.
I have a question on policing. If I could ask that now.
Certainly.
Okay. I just finished 2 books that are more, they're telling me not, in my mind, they're telling me not to work on police reform, but instead to just try to get rid of policing altogether. The books are The End of Policing and also Stakes is High.
I've got The End of Policing somewhere up here. Yes.
Got it. So what I'm struggling with that idea, and because I was raised to respect police and that police are my friend. And of course, I know a little better now, but I still have basic questions and I don't know where to get the answers. Like, well, in that view of no policing, it's like the extreme of defund police. What happens when someone is murdered? That, do you have any resource for me?
So I think that I don't know if you know the activist Mariam Kaba, but her writing on this is exceptional. And I think could be a helpful resource. This is the $1 million question, right? And I'm going to speak not necessarily to the end of policing entirely, but this phrase defund the police that I believe has become a boogeyman in the conversation, unfairly so. And I know that you're not making it that, Miss Mary, but that I just, want to address it because it's probably in the air. I always start these conversations by reminding us that there is a precedent in this country for abolition, that there was an entire economy built off of the enslavement of my ancestors, who folks said it would be impossible to get rid of, because if you get rid of it, what happens to the economy? What happens to all of the people who are employed or able to feed their family through this system, right? that didn't make the system any less immoral. That didn't make the system any less problematic. That didn't make the system any less harmful. And when I think of my enslaved ancestors and their allies working for abolition, they weren't working for a little bit better. They weren't saying, please reform slavery. They were saying abolish it, right? And of course, in a modern lens, one looks back at that time and says, well, of course they said abolish slavery. It was an inhumane institution. You can't reform that. Well, that is what folks are trying to tell us right now about how modern day policing functions. I say that because when you understand the roots of the tree, you understand the fruits of the tree. There's a growing body of historical record and research that connects the dots between slave catchers and modern police departments, even down to the badges that are worn. They're of similar shape, structure, and design to that era. So there is a question as to whether or not something rooted in that can actually be reformed, or does it need to be completely transformed? What I think has happened as people have made the phrase defund the police the boogeyman, right? We saw the GOP commercial that said Joe Biden wants to defund the police. He doesn't. But Joe Biden wants to defund the police. And you see the camera zooming in on a dark office room. It was presumably a police station. You all seen this commercial? It's a police station. It's dark. All the lights are out. All the machines are off. All the computers are off. And there's this phone, and it's ringing. And it's ringing, and it's ringing. And then you hear somebody for Trump voice over, this is Joe Biden's America, right? I mean, the phrase has been perverted and exploited to scare people. I like to remind people that defund the police is not Gotham without Batman. It does not mean that there's nobody on the other end to pick up the phone when you call 911. It means that the right person is on the other end of the phone to pick up 911. Upwards of a third of the people who are killed by police every year have some kind of mental or physical disability, right? So what happens if a mental health professional is at the other end of 911 instead of a police officer? If everything is not a nail, and you can't be a hammer, then we should be thinking about policing in the exact same way, or frankly, we should be thinking about public safety in the same way. So we hear activists using the phrase right now, reimagining public safety, because what does it actually look like to keep our community safe? Right now, the definition is punishment. It is violence. Right now, the definition is more harm than help. We need to flip that and actually make sure that safety is safety, that it is safe, that it is healthy, that it produces better instead of producing worse outcomes like incarceration and more. And so I wanted to address that. I know it's not exactly what you asked, but I wanted to address that because I often find it's the elephant in the room. And whether or not you are in love with the phrasing really isn't the point, I don't think. I think that the point is that ultimately the unfamiliar scares us. And what we are responsible to do, I think, especially as folks on the left, right? Democrats who were able to dream up societies and constitutional amendments that did not exist and get them down on paper. What it is up to us to do is to imagine what is possible and actually go and work toward it. Instead of be obsessed with why it can't happen, start figuring out how we address the issues that might arise, how we actually reimagine the entire thing. I think Miriam Kaba, like I said, should be a great resource. Also, Derica Purnell, who is also a native St. Louisan. She is an activist lawyer. She's currently, I believe, at the Advancement Project. She has some fantastic writings on this in The Atlantic and other places about how she grew into a place where she became a police abolitionist. And so those are two of the voices that I really look to on this particular issue, and hopefully they can be a resource for you as well.
I wonder if you could spell the last names.
Yes. So Miriam is, hold on, I don't want to get it wrong. Let me just look it up really quickly. So Miriam is Mariame, Kaba, Kaba. And then Derica is Derecka, last name Purnell, Purnell.
Thank you.
Sure.
So my name is Dale Steinberg, and I'd like to make a comment and get your reaction and maybe the reaction of other people. Many of my contemporaries look down on politicians as being from the swamp. And they don't differentiate between people involved with politics who are on the up and up and people who are dirty politicians. And I think that's a very insidious skeptical, cynical view. And I wonder what you have to say about that. And, you know, besides having examples like maybe Joe Biden, you know, people like Barack Obama and Joe Biden and people who are really upstanding people. Yeah. Is there any other way to, you know, to confront that idea?
Cynicism is one of the most insidious things we've got to deal with. No, I mean, I identify with your frustration here because unchecked cynicism is corrosive. I mean, it eats away at our ability to keep fighting. It eats away at our ability to come together and find a direction for how we move forward. This is part of the reason why I wrote that timepiece on disciplined hope, because I believe that disciplined hope is not unrealistic. It's not naive. Disciplined hope is disciplined enough to say, here's what reality is, but hopeful enough to say we've won before so we can win again, right? And that for me is the antidote, but it is hard sometimes to sell people on that. I do try to center people in history as much as possible, where I've got John Lewis over my shoulder for a reason, because he, for me, is a source of disciplined hope, that he saw the very worst of America and kept choosing to fight and eventually was able to see better that benefited all of us. I also think, though, that part of this is validating that there is a reason why there are some valid roots to why people are frustrated with politicians, right? And that overwhelming cynicism can be very dangerous. But I think when we don't acknowledge people's pain and frustration and feelings of being unseen, then we lose them to cynicism forever. And look, there have been a lot of people throughout history who have wielded their power in really poor ways, right? Mm-hmm. People who have gotten away with a lot at the cost of all the rest of us. We have all suffered for their shenanigans, shall we say. And I think that there is an overwhelming feeling that too many folks were not ever thought of when these political and electoral systems were created. So why should they be invested now? I remember the first time I met Beto O'Rourke, who of course ran for president, but before that ran for Senate in Texas against Ted Cruz. And I met him during that Senate run. And I was off stage. I had just come off stage. He had gone on stage and he said, you know what? He was talking about whether or not young people are going to be engaged or marginalized people are going to get engaged in this midterm election, especially knowing that midterm elections are notoriously difficult to include people in. And he said, you know, I realized I can't fault people for not participating in a system they never felt listened to them in the first place. So the question is, how do we shift political institutions to be true participatory democracies? When I was on the Ferguson Commission, what I really appreciated about the way Rich McClure and Starsky Wilson led us was that they demonstrated participatory democracy, that our meetings, if any of you came to them, were 20 minutes public comment and an hour small group conversations where facilitators from the community, protesters, teachers, pastors, preachers, trained facilitators, untrained facilitators, they got their training and they came in and they asked every small group 2 basic questions. They said, what is your experience with the issue that we're talking about today? Policing, education, municipal governance, whatever it is. And number 2, what is your solution? Because what we said is the people closest to the pain should be closest to the solution, that the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. That Ferguson Commission document, that final report at forwardthroughferguson.com is an amalgamation not of my ideas or Rasheen's ideas or Starsky's ideas or Rich's ideas. Those are the people's ideas. And we worked through them together over months and months, and it took longer. But people participated in something in a way that I personally had not seen in my lifetime, certainly not in the St. Louis community since I had been doing that work. And so there is an opportunity for us, I think, especially at the hyper local level, to start doing exactly that. To be not just recruiting people to say, come vote, but recruiting people to say, how do you want the rules to work? How do you come to this city council meeting? So, because this is what's on the table. Come to this school board meeting because they're talking about what's in your kids' lunches today, right? And actually inviting people to engage on that little stuff can, I think, make a really, really powerful difference, because then they feel their voices are valued. I think the last thing I'll say is that one of the beautiful things about this moment is that we're seeing a much wider pathway to political office. It used to be a time where you had to have the same 5 jobs in the same order if you were ever going to run for anything, that you needed to be in the armed services or be a public servant of some kind, that you needed to be this many years old, have this many kids, have a dog, have a white picket fence, and then you were electable. But now we see Cori Bush is electable, and we see, AOC is electable, and we see Lauren Underwood, who's a nurse, a public health nurse from Illinois, she's electable, and Lucy McBath, who became an activist because her son Jordan Davis was killed by a racist vigilante in Georgia. She's now, she just got reelected to her, I want to say 2nd or 3rd term to Congress, right? These are much less traditional pathways to elected office, but I think they are helping open up people's imagination to recognize that all of these places are the people's house. The more we see real people in them, the more we can remember that they are the people's house. So yeah, it's a good thing to me that there's a former bartender who's a member of Congress, because how many people do we know out there who are part of the gig economy, who are driving Lyft and driving Uber and doing bartending or being a teacher's assistant because they need to make ends meet, but they've got something to offer our communities. Those folks matter too. And I think the more people we see in those positions who are coming from those much more diverse backgrounds and much more diverse backgrounds experientially, the more people will start, I think, to see themselves in the people's house. I hope that answered your question a bit.
Thank you.
Okay, Brittany, I have one last question.
Okay.
Do you think, this is Florence again, do you think there will be a peaceful transfer of power?
No.
And do you think number 45 will ever concede?
I don't think there will be a peaceful transfer of power, because there's already not a peaceful transfer of power, right? We keep talking about it, and I say we. I'm taking responsibility for this as a person in media. Media is talking about it like it is a future tense issue. The transition has begun. And I was talking to some people about this today, because there was all of this chatter online and people were like, well, Joe Biden can't do anything yet. You guys are asking him unrealistic things. Wait till after January 20th. And I'm like, oh, wait. People who live outside the Beltway or who are not active in small d Democratic politics do not know that the transition is a process, right? You all know that. You know that, Ms. Florence. But everyday people do not realize that once somebody becomes president-elect and there is a changing of the guard, that changing of the guard takes time, and that transition team leads are hired, and that people are examining transition policies, and they're combing through hundreds of thousands of resumes to figure out who's going to be everything from Secretary of Education to, the junior assistant secretary of paper filing, right? They don't know that this is happening. So part of political education is making sure that people understand the processes of democracy. And I say that to say there's not going to be a peaceful transfer of power, because there's already not a peaceful transfer of power. The Trump administration is already not cooperating with the Biden-Harris transition teams. They are already losing and missing connections and access to information that they should be able to have. President Obama, I just did Ari Melber on MSNBC right before getting on with you all, and we talked about this, because Barack Obama and Michelle Obama are honestly doing what they normally don't do and being very frank about what needs to happen right now. Normally they kind of play to the background, but they're coming out and saying, look, We didn't agree with George W. Bush on most anything. They didn't agree with us on most anything, but they still did what is democratically respected and expected in this country and engaged in a peaceful transition of power. Their teams gave us access to the documents. They walked us through how one runs a White House and how one runs a country. They opened up the door of their homes to us, and they helped us understand how to do this thing so that on day one, we were ready. Because if you're not ready by day one, it's already too late, right? This is the one job in the world where you cannot, we need you not to learn this stuff on the job, especially not in the middle of a recession and a pandemic. So this is already not a peaceful transfer of power. We have someone who is stalling the transition, who is standing in the doorway, not letting people come in, who is not allowing his staff members to provide access, and who is continuously trying to run away with the narrative that he won this election. Just a couple of blocks from my house over this weekend was the Million MAGA March. I say million in quotes because there were nowhere close to 1 million people. However, the people who were here were zealous about their beliefs. They fully believe that this election was a fraud. They fully believe that once all the votes are counted, even though they've all been counted, that we will come to find out that Trump was the true winner, and that anything else, irrespective of whatever facts and figures you give them, anything less than a Trump win is an impossibility, is a statistical falsehood. So he is not depending on the courts to get this thing to him because he knows they won't. He knows they lost. He even said in a tweet the other day, Joe Biden won because blah, blah, blah. He then said fraud, fraud, fraud. But at first he said he won, right? So you know he won. You know you lost. And here you are still trying to run away with this narrative because you know that the most zealous people in your base will continue to push this narrative, some of them by any means necessary. And so I am not actually worried about the peacefulness of the transfer of power at the White House level, even though I think they'll have to drag him out kicking and screaming. I'm worried about the peacefulness at the people level. I'm worried about the folks that I watched come into an almost majority Black city this weekend and rip down Black Lives Matter signs. I'm worried about the people who came into this city this weekend and beat up protesters and the Metropolitan Police just walked by as it happened. I'm worried about the folks who come through to places like Charlottesville, toting guns out loud, saying, I dare somebody to get in my face, running over people like Heather Heyer with their cars. That's who I'm worried about. And Trump continues to stoke their zealousness. He continues to stoke their belief in him as their supreme leader in an almost cult-like fashion. And so I am truly worried. And I think that it is going to be incumbent upon Republicans to stand up out loud and say, you have to step aside. Like I said, the Republicans are long-term planners. They know how to get after this thing. They're not worried about whether or not Trump wins or loses. They are already planning for the next one. They are already figuring out how to install a very friendly, primetime ready, white supremacist supporter in his place, right? She might be a woman this time. She might be a brown woman this time. They are ready for the next step. They are going to have to be the ones that actually step up to move him aside, because he's not going to listen to the people who intimidate him. And we know Barack Obama intimidates him. We know that Democrats intimidate him. We know that people who've won their elections intimidate him. So I think it's going to be really important to win these two races in Georgia. It's going to be really important to wrestle back control of Congress. It's going to be really important to make sure that judges are doing the right thing. And yes, that means people power standing outside of courts or emailing and making the phone calls and doing what we need to do. And it's going to be really important to pushing our Republican colleagues, our Republican representatives, to standing up for democracy, not for a party, but for democracy. I'll close with this. Michelle Obama said today in her an Instagram caption that she wrote, where she was very candid about how angry she was when the Trumps won, but she still sucked it up and welcomed Melania in. She talked to her about raising children in the White House and living under more public scrutiny. She did that even though, Donald Trump had created a false scare around Barack Obama with his birtherism and kind of whipped up this racist frenzy that put her family in danger. She did that anyway. But what she said today was the presidency does not belong to a party. It belongs to the people. And it's going to be up to our colleagues on all sides of the aisle to decide that our future as a democracy is more important than a single win that threatens, frankly, to tear at an already incredibly fragile system. And so I make no bones about the fact that he's not going to go quietly into the night. Narcissists don't know how to do that. But it is going to be up to we the people to hold all the rest of the folks accountable to making sure that we can get on with our lives and get on to getting better.
Thank you, Brittany. I'd like to ask a question, bring it a little more local, since you were on the Ferguson committee. You'd said there's 18,000 police departments across the country. I think that most of them are here in St. Louis County.
That was good, Harvey. It's true.
Yeah. So do you think that there's some merit in combining the police departments here? And if you do, how would that be done? And what can we locally do to help move that along?
I don't think I've been asked that before. I don't, because I'm in the divest to reinvest camp. I'm in the camp that says, you know, police departments keep getting a raise every year when they're being just as violent, if not more, when they're not solving as many crimes, and when they're eating up very large proportions of metropolitan and municipal budgets. So I'm of the belief that you should be pulling money from those institutions and putting them into the institutions that help people. An example is pulling police out of schools. There are large proportions of city and county budgets that go into putting police in schools. And while kids are not in school, what better time to actually work on moving that money elsewhere? That money could be used to close the broadband gap for a lot of young people who are expected to do virtual learning, who do not have access to broadband internet or the devices that they need to learn on Zoom like we're doing right now. That money can be used to feed children who are not being given food outside of the food that they receive at school. That money rather can be used to actually create strong housing for people who are living in places where there's lead chipping off of the walls and lead in the water. So I actually don't think that making bigger police departments, even if that means that we're combining them, is the idea. I really think it's about challenging municipalities to look at their budgets and actually have them reflect the will of the people. There's a really great example in the work of the People's Budget LA. It is a campaign that is being fueled by Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, but it's actually represents a conglomerate of organizing collectives from around the city. And what they've done for people, again, to this conversation of political education, is they've illustrated what the police budget looks like and how much more money is going to policing than housing, working on homelessness, education, or there's one other big one, or healthcare. And so when you lay that out so clearly for people, they're saying, this actually doesn't make any sense, right? Because we know healthy, safe communities start from the ground up. They start with strong housing. They start with livable wages. They start with good schools. They start with clean air and clean water. They start with healthy access to healthy foods. If we reinvested in that stuff and stopped investing in an institution that continues to harm us, what is possible? People's Budget LA is doing some of that work. Minneapolis, the collectives there and the city council there is doing some of that work. I actually think that that's the future. I think that's the future. I think that in 2015, we were talking about consolidating police departments to get us out of some immediate harm. But I think that because there is so much wind at our back right now, I actually don't think that we have to do step A to get to step B. I think we can actually go straight ahead.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, we're pretty much at our meeting's end time. I want to thank you. This has been tremendous. I appreciate all the work that you have done and that you are doing. I think I speak for just about everybody on the Zoom today.
Thank
And,
you very much.
would
Thank you for all
would
you
come
all are
back
doing.
and speak with us again, maybe 6 months, 9 months down the road, give us an update.
I'd love to. I'd love to. Thank you all for all that you are doing and for signing up to do the hard work because it happens in our community. So thank you all so much. And thanks for being here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Good
Harvey,
night.
thank
Yes,
you.
ma'am.
Harvey, I have an
Yeah, go ahead,
announcement.
Florence.
Yes, the Creve Coeur Township will not be meeting next month. Usually in December, we do not have a meeting. So we'll meet back again in January. And Brittany, thank you again for coming, being with us tonight. It was a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you. And I thank you so much. And thanks to so many of the familiar faces and voices. And thanks to the folks I just met. Let's go get it done.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
Brittany.
Good night. Thank you.
While we have
Great job.
everyone on, this is probably a good opportunity. If anyone else has any announcements, any upcoming activist events or anything like that that you want to invite people to, now's not a bad time to do that. Okay. I think everyone's probably all spent from all the
Gone.
election work. So we will see you in January. Watch
Great
for
meeting.
our emails. Thanks again. Are we done? Are we good, Florence?
I think we're good. Thank you so much, Harvey.
Okay, thank you.
Great meeting.
Bye, everyone.
Good
Bye-bye.
night. Good night, Imelda.
Good night.